Welcome to Inside View. I'm your host, Dana Nichols. I'm the editor of the Calaveras Enterprise, and with me today is Chris Fettig. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Dana.
Chris, you're a research entomologist with the U.S. Forest Service. Tell me briefly what an entomologist is and what you do for the Forest Service.
Well, as you mentioned, I am a research entomologist with the Forest Service with the Pacific Southwest Research Station, so the research and development branch of our agency. And a research entomologist essentially is somebody who studies effects of insects on the environment. My specialty is that of forest entomology. Perhaps I function a little more broadly as a disturbance ecologist or a forest health specialist. So much of the work I do and those other scientists on my team, we look at the effects of insects, disease, wildfire, climate change, and there are many different interactions on the forest environment.
Well, you might have a lot to say to us here. We had a huge fire. It wasn't in the national forest land so much as it was in the lower elevations and private property. And we also have trees dying from, I believe it's the western pine beetle.
Yes.
And I was hoping that you would tell, you've been doing this work 15 years with the Forest Service?
About 15 years, yes. 15? I've been working with the agency.
And have you spent any time in Calaveras County Forest?
Yes, sure has.
What kind of things have you seen here?
Well, just recently, we're experiencing this very large tree mortality event. The most recent data collected from Aerial Detection Survey, a group within our agency, reporting somewhere on the order of about 66 million trees have been killed in the last several years here in the central as well as the southern Sierras.
And it's worse in the south?
Tends to be worse in the south, yes.
So Calaveras County officials just approved to buy a second set of satellite photos. They got some done in the spring, and now they're going to have another set done. And it's of a level of detail. They're doing it to look at marijuana farms, but they said that they could use it for forestry too. And you said good. I'm wondering, what should they look for? I mean, what could they find out about tree mortality from looking at these satellite images?
Well, one of the things I would be interested in seeing is what's been the uptick since the last aerial detection survey. They last released their data, if I recall correctly, back in June of 2016, and that's when they were reporting 66 million trees. I imagine there's been a large uptick since that point in time.
Okay. Is the mortality concentrated in particular areas? Does it tend to be closer to people, out in the middle of the forest? I mean, where is it?
It's increasing throughout the forest. It's increasing throughout the elevational bands within the forest, but I would argue that most of the tree mortality is occurring as a result of a western pine beetle outbreak in ponderosa pine, and the distribution of that tree species tends to be concentrated more in the lower to mid elevations of our forests here in the central and southern Sierra Nevada.
And that's where a lot of people have houses.
It sure is.
Okay. Tell me a little about the western pine beetle and why it causes trees to die.
Sure. Well, yeah, bark beetles in general, I guess I'll make the point, is you're talking about a very large, fascinating, and diverse group. There are greater than 6,000 species worldwide, greater than 550 in North America alone. We tend to focus on species that cause a lot of tree mortality. We call them economically important species. And so under certain circumstances, like extended drought, they're capable of causing large amounts of tree mortality. Here in the state of California, 7 or 8 species might meet that definition in our conifer forests. And the ponderosa pine component, by far the most important, would be the western pine beetle.
Okay, and it's a tiny little thing? I mean, how big is it?
Tiny little thing, smaller than a grain of rice.
So do you have to, peel bark back to get at it? Do you find it in other situations? How do you even get a look at this thing? Yeah,
so basically a bark beetle's job is to get from one tree to the next tree as quickly as possible. So we are able, in many cases, once a tree dies, up to several years post-mortem, come back, remove the bark, and they actually leave very distinct gallery patterns that we can use as signatures to diagnose the actual cause of tree mortality.
Oh, okay. So those signatures might tell you that it wasn't the beetle that killed it?
It wasn't, yeah. It could tell you which beetle. I could tell you there was an absence of beetle. You may find other contributing factors as well.
So I've also heard of a species called the mountain pine beetle. You've studied this one too?
Yes, I have.
And is this one also active here, or is that more in other parts of the West?
Mountain pine beetle is active in our forest as well.
Okay.
Mountain pine beetle is quite distinct from some of our other bark beetles because it has a very large host range, about 16 or 17 different species in the wildland system. Most bark beetles have very small or narrow host ranges. For example, the western pine beetle in this area of the world only colonizes ponderosa pine.
Okay.
Further south in Southern California, it colonizes coulter pine as well, but here just ponderosa pine. We do have mountain pine beetle in our ponderosa pine component here. We do have mountain pine beetle in our sugar pine component, our lodgepole pine component, and even in our high elevation five-needle pines.
But the mountain pine beetle kills firs too, or?
No, it kills primarily pines,
Okay.
also a few spruces, but primarily pines. It's most noted for the large amount of tree mortality that's caused in the lodgepole pine forest throughout much of the Rocky Mountains.
Oh, the Rockies.
Yeah.
Now, tell me a little bit about the particular conditions now that are making the western pine beetle a problem for us. Why specifically is this beetle blowing up its population?
Quite simply, in this area, drought. Basically, you don't have these large-scale bark beetle outbreaks, whichever one we're discussing, unless you have two conditions being met, and that is you have favorable forest conditions and favorable climatic conditions coinciding in time and space.
Okay.
So in terms of favorable forest conditions, you need large numbers of suitable hosts on the landscape. We have those. We have very dense forests containing large numbers of suitable hosts. We also need a climatic trigger, and the climatic trigger here has been drought. And I'm sure, as you are likely aware, California now is in its fifth year of severe drought. Last year was the warmest and driest on record. 2014 was the third driest and second warmest on record. We have a lot of vegetation that's really stressed on the landscape. And in that particular system, western pine beetle populations have been able to respond and cause large amounts of tree mortality in the ponderosa pine component.
Okay. What happens if the drought goes on a long time? I mean, the archaeological record says droughts could last, 50 years, 100 years?
Yeah, so the longer the drought goes on, the more and more stress our trees will become and the more susceptible they'll become to these types of disturbances. Bark beetles obviously just being one of the more important ones in our conifer forests here in the West.
Do you have any thoughts on what to do about the change in the forest? I mean, obviously, a lot of ponderosa pines are going to go away. What's a reasonable human response to that? Do we want to replace them? Do we want to just... What do we want to do?
We're still working on that. There's quite a bit of discussion and debate going on. Should we actually look at and anticipate the climate signal we're likely going to be dealing with in the future and adapt our management accordingly? So in areas where we have had, for example, very high levels of ponderosa pine mortality at some of the very low elevations, do we still manage for ponderosa pine in those systems, or do we anticipate a change in the dominant floristics as a result of the climate signal we're dealing with and the climate signal we're likely to expect in the future?
And when you say dominant floristics, that means different flora and fauna? I mean,
right.
We're talking about
flora. Yeah, so different dominant vegetation.
So it might not be for timber as we know it at all. It could be for some other management purpose, grazing or something like that. Okay. You've published papers on how to manage beetle infestations.
Sure.
We've got a whole lot of homeowners and private property owners that are wrestling with this. Do you have any suggestions for strategies that are appropriate for them?
Yeah, there are quite a few tools that are available out there to reduce the impacts of the beetle, generally on small spatial scales, which is what most homeowners tend to be generally interested in. I've published quite extensively and worked quite extensively in this area of R&D. In terms of management strategies, I like to divide them into what we call direct control and indirect control. Direct control being kind of short-term tactics focused on current infestations, trying to manipulate the beetle to reduce levels of tree mortality through the use of things like insecticides, whether those be actually sprayed on the bole of a tree or injected directly into the tree. Semiochemicals, and for those who are not familiar, semiochemicals are simply a chemical produced by one organism that elicits a response. We usually focus on behavioral responses in another organism. And so we've actually been able to study the semiochemicals that many of these bark beetles use to communicate and manipulate that system and apply some of those semiochemicals to reduce levels of tree mortality attributed to certain types of bark beetles.
Now, is that something I can go buy in my hardware store and use?
Yeah, there are a few products that are what we call general use, so they're not restricted use. You don't have to be a certified pesticide applicator to buy and use some of those types of products.
Can you give me how would I find it? What would I ask for?
One of the best ways to find it is to, contact your local county ag extension type person. There's quite a bit of information, as you would expect now, on the internet as well. But there is a lot of information out there. Again, these types of tools tend to be used on very small scale to protect a few trees or a group of trees or a couple acres of trees in your backyard.
Okay, so if I have some ponderosas that still look healthy, and can I even tell? Is it even possible to look at the tree and tell whether it's already infested?
Yes. So, the more experience you have, the easier it would be to tell. But generally, you would start looking at the needles. If the needles are green, then you would want to look very closely at the bole. And if you see absence of pitch tubes, which is a response of a healthy tree when a beetle bores into the tree tends to release resin. We call that a pitch tube. You've probably seen that on some trees in the landscape. But when trees get really, really stressed, they're no longer capable of really producing pitch. So what you would be looking at for is small amounts of boring dust on the bole of the tree, at the base of the tree, and that would indicate that the tree is currently being colonized by beetles.
Is it too late by then?
At that time, it's too late, yes.
So I'm looking for trees where the needles are green, there's no pitch tubes, or very few?
Yes, in some cases.
And then I can use one of the pesticides or one of the semiochemicals you mentioned?
Sure.
Okay, and these are things I can get at my hardware store?
In some cases, yes. Some of them are restricted use, others are available for the public.
So people wonder, too, if infested trees are cut down, is there anything to do to prevent the beetles from going from those infested trees to other trees?
Yeah, so that's another method of direct control, like I mentioned earlier. So insecticides, semiochemicals. The third primary component would be what we call sanitation harvest, and that's what you're referencing. So you're able to identify a tree that's been colonized, but it's currently occupied by the beetles.
Right.
And so you can, in some cases, remove that tree, destroy the brood within that tree, thereby preventing those beetles from emerging from that tree and colonizing adjacent trees on the landscape.
I'm not sure we're there, because I think that what happens is, for example, Pacific Gas and Electric Company needs to remove trees to protect its utility lines. The trees get cut down so they no longer threaten the lines, but then they're stacked up on the edges of property owners' yards, waiting for the larger world to figure out a way to dispose of them. Having them sit there then is not a good idea, because then the beetles remaining will just migrate.
Really depends,
elsewhere.
Actually, because in many cases, if you drop a currently infested tree and sunlight is actually reaching the bole of that tree, in our systems, in many of our systems here in California, the temperatures within the bark then can get high enough to kill that developing brood.
Okay, so that's a positive step, just to get
Can be,
down.
yeah. I mean, there's a lot of nuance there depending on the distribution of the logs and how they're positioned and how hot the temperatures get. But yeah, there is a direct control technique specifically called solarization, where you actually felt that material and try to either desiccate it or heat the developing brood as high as possible to destroy it.
So it's not necessarily an infestation problem to have the logs there if they're in the sun and they get warm.
Not necessarily.
That could be an okay solution. Because with the volume of logs between the fires we've had recently and the beetle infestations, this county is struggling just to find places to process the logs.
Sure.
And it's outstripped what the mills can take at the moment. Is this happening elsewhere too?
Yes,
I mean, all over
it's
the
happening
place?
elsewhere and throughout Western North America. When we've been dealing with some of these large-scale outbreaks, it's happening everywhere. We just, in many areas, don't have the infrastructure available to deal with this type of material.
Okay, now you say outbreaks, so obviously there's been ones in the past, there's others elsewhere. Do you have a name for this one? Do you call it the Sierra Nevada outbreak?
No, I don't. I don't have a name for it, and I don't believe that we have a name for it. But it is going to be a very notable one.
Well, how does it compare to the others? I mean, just give me a sense of magnitude. Is it
well, in general, the way
top 10?
Yeah, I would argue definitely in the top 10, at least in my experience. The way I like to look at it is, in general, in the last decade or two, we've seen elevated levels of tree mortality attributed to bark beetles in many of our different forest cover types throughout Western North America. And so when I look at that data, I would argue that we have what I call 5 grand champions. These are bark beetle outbreaks of a magnitude or extent that we hadn't seen in at least recorded history.
Okay.
And so the first I would list, you alluded to earlier, is mountain pine beetle outbreak, really throughout much of Western North America. As I mentioned, several different hosts impacted. To put that outbreak into perspective, and it's winding down, but to put it into perspective, greater than 27 million hectares have been impacted by that beetle. That's an area larger than our 11 smallest states, South Carolina on down combined.
Oh my goodness.
So I would list that as kind of the most notable in recorded history. From there, we had a very notable spruce beetle outbreak on the Kenai Peninsula in south central Alaska, where that beetle essentially killed all susceptible Lutz spruce. And a lot of people aren't familiar with that species, but it's this naturally occurring hybrid between Sitka spruce and white spruce in that area of the world. Tremendous amount of pinyon pine mortality, as you probably recall in the early 2000s.
Okay.
Much of that attributed to a drought and pinyon ips, another bark
Right.
beetle. And then 2 examples here from California. We had another western pine beetle outbreak in the early 2000s down in the San Bernardino, one that I argue is a great model for what we might expect to see here. And I used to list that as number 4. I suspect the impact of that western pine beetle outbreak will be exceeded by this outbreak.
So this has made the top 5, but
This will make my top 5, yes.
So it could be 4 or 5.
Right.
Okay.
We'll see.
But you're not considering similar things elsewhere in the world. This is just for Western North America.
This is just for Western North America, yeah.
Are there similar things happening elsewhere in the world?
There are. There's a lot of large tree mortality events. But in particular, North America seems to be graced with this large group of very aggressive bark beetles. So we do tend to have large outbreaks here in North America. There are outbreaks in Europe as well as in some portions of Asia, China in particular. But in terms of what's going on in the bark beetle world, most of what's happening is happening here, and most of it of late has been in Western North America.
Do you in your job talk to the people that decide how to spend Forest Service resources addressing these problems?
No, not directly.
Not directly.
We're frequently asked to advise them on certain
Okay.
issues, but no, not
Okay.
in terms of policy or funding different.
And I just ask because, of course, that's one big question is do we get whatever resources we need to
Sure.
to maintain forest health, and it sure looks like there's a lot of work that needs to be done. It's hard to use fire regimens because a lot of the forests are near where people live.
Yeah.
All this is familiar ground, I'm sure.
Sure, yeah. There is a lot of work being done, not only within the context of the federal government and our agency in particular, but also obviously in terms of the state and CAL FIRE.
Okay. Tell me about the beetles and fire. If a fire goes through, does that kill the beetles and make things better, or am I completely crazy here? I mean, it's an intuitively appealing idea.
Yeah, it's something that's getting quite a bit of discussion and debate, particularly in the popular press as of late. And so obviously when a bark beetle outbreak goes through a forest, depends on the severity, but in some cases, like we're seeing here today, a lot of tree mortality may occur in a relatively short period of time. Mm-hmm. And that obviously has implications to the fuel conditions and distribution. And so you affect the fuels, you can affect fire risk and severity. And so, as you know, there's been a lot of debate in the literature and primarily in the popular press as to what's the net impact. And what I would argue, and most of my research has been limited to mountain pine beetle and lodgepole pine in the Rocky Mountains, so not directly applicable to this situation. But what I would argue that is getting lost in the discussion is this concept of time since disturbance. So we tend to divide the forest into what we call a bark beetle rotation, and you have 3 different stages. And so you have this kind of endemic stage where little or no tree mortality is occurring, a few trees killed every couple years, every couple acres, kind of a healthy condition. That's what bark beetles are supposed to do. I mean, I do want to be clear, we're talking about native organisms here that under normal circumstances really are critical to the proper functioning of these ecosystems. So that's that endemic condition. Nobody notices it, it doesn't make it in the press, and that can last for decades. Then you have this stage that we're in, this epidemic stage, where large amounts of tree mortality in relatively short periods of time in the system we're largely focusing on maybe over a period of 2 to 4 years. And then you have, after that, you have this very long post-epidemic stage where all that material that has died eventually comes and falls to the forest floor, and you can see how that affects fuels over time and how it might affect fire risk and severity. In fact, one of the things we're working on is we're actually working with the firefighter community to accumulate anecdotal evidence from them and their experiences working in these forests where they have large amounts of beetle-altered fuels. But really, the net effect really depends on which of those stages you're talking about, so it can get very complex in a relatively short period of time. But there can be big impacts, yes.
Meaning that that we could have more beetles after a fire or fewer beetles after a fire, or?
Yeah, in that context, so that's a little bit of a different situation. When we're looking at bark beetle and fire interactions, we either talk about the first relationship where you're looking at the effects of all this tree mortality caused by bark beetles on subsequent fire behavior, sure, if a fire were to occur. And then on the other end, we look at the effects of fire stressing residual trees and how beetles might respond to that. And in our research, we've looked quite a bit at that relationship as well, particularly in the context of fuel reduction treatments, which is something we're doing quite a bit in the WUI in this area of the world as well. And what we see there, originally we were kind of concerned that there might be a very strong bark beetle response and there might be large amounts of tree mortality occurring, for example, after you put a prescribed fire through a forest. And generally what we've seen in most of the studies that we've executed throughout the West is that we do see a response. We do see a small increase in the amount of tree mortality attributed to bark beetles after a prescribed fire, but it tends to be relatively short-term, concentrated in the smaller diameter classes, which in many cases are the very trees that you're trying to reduce their presence of by putting a prescribed fire through the stand.
Okay, so where the Butte fire burned, it was more of a gray pine forest, but there are some ponderosas there too. If somebody has a ponderosa that got scorched and blackened, but the needles are still green, is that ponderosa at any more risk for a beetle infestation?
It can
now?
be, yes.
So the damage to it could weaken it.
Yeah, it could weaken it, stresses the trees, and it may make it more vulnerable to successful colonization by the beetles.
Yeah, because there's been some debate. Property owners don't want still green trees to go away in some cases, and yet sometimes the foresters that we hire say, well, that one's a hazard tree.
Yep.
And that may be a factor, as it could be that, okay, the beetles are going to get to it.
Yeah, and there's several factors that you can look at, and it's sometimes difficult to predict that relationship. But yes, if you stress a tree with prescribed fire under certain circumstances, that tree may be more susceptible to colonization by bark beetles. The important point being that you have bark beetles that are present at certain levels to take advantage of that new resource on the landscape.
Okay. I wanted to touch, I don't want to run out of time without asking you a little bit about why did you become an entomologist, with this forestry interest? I mean, I wanted to hear a little about that.
Well, I became an entomologist a little bit by accident, but, I was fortunate enough to grow up in a family that owned some forest land, and I fell in love with the forest at a relatively young age, and as they say, the rest is history. How I became a forest entomologist is even a more interesting story. I was working on my undergraduate at Virginia Tech at the time.
Okay.
And I actually wanted to stay there during the summer. In order to do that, I needed a job during the summer. And so I called my advisor over in the forestry school, and she indicated that there was this professor working in the area of forest entomology that was looking for an assistant that summer, and one job, and here I am almost 20 years later.
Well, that's awesome. So as a Westerner, I'm thinking of tall pines and firs and a forest. Was that the kind of forest that your family was managing?
No, that's primarily northern hardwoods, so beech, birch, maple.
Oh, okay. So it's a
very different than our systems, yeah.
Outstanding.
Yeah, I've been fortunate to work in many different areas within the country and a little bit overseas as well, but northern hardwoods and then in the southeast and obviously for the last 15 years or so throughout much of western North America.
Excellent. So let me see what else I wanted to ask about. You talk about ecosystem disturbances as sort of the general field that you work within a lot. Tell us, if you can, a little bit about what's an ecosystem disturbance and how big a disturbance is a pine beetle infestation compared to other stuff that we might be seeing.
Okay, so when we use the term disturbance ecology, a disturbance is just a discrete event that releases growing space, causes mortality of vegetation, and then that growing space becomes available to other vegetation that survives. So, it can be something that affects all vegetation, like drought, or it can be something that only affects certain types of vegetation, like a specific defoliator that may only feed on a certain host. So we, in general, will look at those different types of relationships. Obviously, the interactions I've most recently focused on are bark beetles and wildfire. Mm-hmm. Bark beetles are very important, particularly in our western coniferous forests. There's been some recent data that's been published that shows bark beetles cause more tree mortality than actually wildfires do in western North America.
I'll be darned, like order of magnitude more?
No, just slightly more.
Just slightly more. So that is sort of the way that humans have certain things we die of. That's sort of one of the natural ways that trees die. Yeah.
Again, just to be clear, most of the species, all the species that we've been discussing here today, are native organisms that are, been in these ecosystems for millennia.
And the drought just sort of speeds that up.
In this context, yes.
Okay. Where to next? I mean, do you have a sense of what the next outbreak is that you'll be working on?
Well, these things kind of ebb and flow as they go through these various systems. Right now, what we're starting to see in the Rockies is an uptick in spruce beetle. So we're seeing quite a bit of elevation now in our high elevation spruce forests in the Rocky Mountains attributed to spruce beetle.
Are the high elevation forests generally more resistant to this type of problem, or is it not like that?
They tend to have longer cycles. Things just tend to occur much more slowly. Again, triggers are different. I mentioned this large spruce beetle outbreak on the Kenai Peninsula in south central Alaska. There, it was a climatic trigger as well. But specifically there, it wasn't drought. It was warming temperatures during the summer that allowed a portion of that population to go from a 2-year life cycle to a 1-year life cycle. And you can imagine the implications of that to population dynamics over time. So the real issue is that most of these bark beetles are very intimately associated with their hosts. And when there are changes in the systems, they can respond at big numbers.
We only have about 3 minutes. Give me a little bit of a description of what it's like when you're working in the field. What do you have to do? How hard is it to get to the places you need to go to? How do you find these beetles?
Well, generally, for me in particular, I work very close with another part of our agency, another deputy area in state and private forestry. We have a group called Forest Health Protection. And in that group, there are forest health specialists, entomologists, pathologists, some other classifications as well. And so these are people that are very intimately associated with a particular landscape. In many cases, they'll contact me or I'll contact them. And we'll work quite closely together using research to address some of their specific needs.
Okay. So we've got just a couple of minutes left. So let's just briefly review. There are things property owners can do.
Sure.
And your top suggestions would be save the ones that can still be saved, and just briefly describe how you identify trees that could still be saved and find the appropriate strategy.
Okay, so there are things to do. In terms of protecting the few trees that you have on your lot, you're generally talking about several different insecticides that are registered within the state. And the way you can find out what's actually registered is consult the California Department of Pesticide Regulations website. There are a few semiochemicals, but they're not as effective as insecticides, particularly when the populations are very high like they are today. We talked a little bit about sanitation harvest, sometimes combinations thereof. In long term, what we really like to stress is thinning, reducing the susceptibility of these forests to bark beetle outbreaks by reducing stand density.
Chris, thank you so much for coming and speaking with us. I'm sure many people are going to listen to what you've had to say today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dana.